It began with a complaint. By the 1840s, New York City was loud, crowded, and restless. Horses thundered through muddy streets. Smoke from factories blackened the air. The city had grown so fast that it felt ready to burst. Amid the noise and chaos, a few voices began to ask a simple but daring question. Where could a New Yorker go to breathe? In those years, New York was not yet the shining metropolis people imagine today. Manhattan was filling up with people from across the world. Ships brought immigrants daily, and tenements rose quickly to hold them. There were no large public parks, only small squares where children played between carts and trash. Wealthy families escaped the dirt by riding their carriages north of the city. They wanted space and scenery. Many had visited London's Hyde Park and Paris's Bois de Boulogne. They wondered why New York had nothing of the kind. One of them was William Cullen Bryant, a poet and newspaper editor. He wrote that the city needed a great public park for health, rest, and pride. Another was Andrew Jackson Downing, a landscape designer who dreamed of an open park filled with water, trees, and meadows. Downing called it a necessity for a city that hopes to be great. Their voices spread through the city papers. Slowly, the idea caught the attention of those in power. By the early 1850s, politicians and landowners began to see both civic and economic reasons for a park. A grand public space could lift the city's image and increase property values nearby. The city legislature, pressed by Bryant and his allies, approved the search for a site. But finding land in Manhattan was a battle. The island was narrow, and its land was valuable. After much debate, they chose a stretch between 59th and 106th Streets, from 5th to 8th Avenue, more than 700 acres of rough, uneven ground. It was rocky, swampy, and home to around 1,600 residents, mostly poor workers, immigrants, and free African Americans. This part of the story is seldom told, but it is vital. Among those who lived there was a settlement called Seneca Village. Founded in the 1920s, it was one of the first communities of African American property owners in New York. The residents built homes, a school, and 3 churches. They lived peacefully, raising families and working in nearby areas. But when the city decided to take the land for the park, their future ended. In 1853, the state used eminent domain, a law that allowed the government to seize land for public use. The residents were forced to leave. They were promised payment for their land, but many never received it. By 1857, Seneca Village was gone. Its homes were demolished. Only a few documents and scattered records remained to prove it existed. With the land cleared, attention turned to design. The city announced a major public competition. 33 entries were submitted, each offering a vision for what this park could be. 2 men stood out: Frederick Law Olmsted, a farmer and journalist, and Calvert Vaux, a British architect. Together, they submitted the Greensward Plan. Their design was radical. It proposed meadows, lakes, and wooded paths that would make visitors feel free and calm, no matter their social class. Roads for carriages were hidden below the landscape to preserve the natural views. Olmsted and Vaux believed the park should belong to everyone, not just the rich. They wrote, "It is a democratic development of the highest significance." In April 1858, their plan won. Building Central Park was far from easy. The land was filled with swamps, rocks, and clay. Workers, many of them Irish and German immigrants, used picks, shovels, and horse carts to reshape the ground. Over the next decade, more than 20,000 workers would dig, blast, and plant the landscape into existence. More than 270,000 trees and shrubs were planted. Lakes were carved by hand. Roads and bridges were built from granite and sandstone. But the work was not without pain. Laborers endured harsh weather, low pay, and dangerous conditions. Blasting powder injured and killed some. Their names were never recorded. While construction went on, debates raged across the city. Critics said the park was a playground for the wealthy. Others said it wasted tax money. Newspapers mocked the idea that the poor would walk among fountains and gardens. Olmsted countered that the park would improve the morals and health of the city. He believed nature could heal what the industrial city had broken. By the end of 1857, parts of the southern area began to resemble the drawings. Paths curved gracefully through open lawns. The first lake reflected the city's skyline far in the distance. Visitors began to arrive on foot and by carriage. Still, the dream was far from finished. The park that would one day become the heart of New York was only a skeleton then, a work in progress surrounded by mud and noise. But hope hung in the air. People came not just to see what was being built, but to believe that such beauty could exist in a growing city. By 1858, Central Park was no longer just an idea, it was a battleground of ambition, politics, and vision. Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux had won the design contest, but their victory was only the beginning of a much harder fight, keeping control of their creation. The Greensward Plan had promised something new, a park for everyone. Olmsted wanted calm paths for walking, wide meadows for rest, and lakes that reflected the city's light without the city's noise. But in New York, nothing stayed pure for long. The city's political machine, led by Tammany Hall, had its own ideas. Power brokers and wealthy investors saw Central Park as a symbol they could use. Contracts meant money, and money meant influence. The park commissioners, appointed by the state, were divided. Some admired Olmsted's idealism. Others wanted more control over how and where money was spent. From the start, every tree, every road, and every dollar became a point of argument. While the politicians fought, the workers kept building. Men labored through freezing winters and burning summers. They dug lakes, raised bridges, and paved carriage roads by hand. The work was relentless. Yet each piece they finished revealed more of Olmsted and Vaux's vision, a place where nature and city could meet without destroying each other. By 1860, the mall, the lake, and Bethesda Terrace began to take form. Visitors came in increasing numbers, wandering through unfinished landscapes, curious to see what this strange new park might become. But behind the calm scenery, Olmsted faced growing opposition. His commitment to social equality, his belief that the park belonged to all people, angered those who preferred to keep the city's best pleasures exclusive.
Then came the Civil War. In 1861, as the nation split, funding for the park was cut. Construction slowed, and attention shifted to the war. Many workers left to join the army. Olmsted himself, driven by duty, resigned his position as park superintendent to serve the United States Sanitary Commission, organizing aid for soldiers. Calvert Vaux continued the work, but the vision suffered without Olmsted's leadership. The commissioners, now dominated by political figures, changed plans to favor their interests. The landscape began to drift from its original balance between open beauty and human order. Still, through hardship, the park grew. By 1863, more than half of the project was complete. Lakes shimmered where swamps once stood. The Ramble was alive with new greenery. Yet something was missing, the guiding hand that had held it all together. In 1865, when the Civil War ended, Olmsted returned to New York. The park he found was different, still grand, but shaped by too many hands. The commissioners had made changes without consulting him or Vaux. Some of the features were altered for political show, not designed purpose. Olmsted wrote in frustration that the park had been subjected to influences which may destroy its very intention. In 1866, with help from reformers, he and Vaux regained their official positions. Together, they tried to restore what had been lost. They reworked parts of the landscape, refined the plantings, and returned to the principle that the park should refresh the mind and body of all classes. But no creation in New York was safe from politics. Tammany Hall still controlled city contracts and used the park's maintenance as a source of profit. Invoices were inflated. Corruption spread quietly through the system. Olmsted and Vaux found themselves at odds with the city's park commissioners once again. Their letters grew sharper, their meetings more tense. At the heart of it all was a simple question: who owned the park, the people who built it, or the politicians who paid for it? Olmsted's sense of duty would not let him surrender easily. He continued to fight for the park's integrity, defending its democratic purpose in public speeches and reports. But the pressure wore him down. By 1870, Tammany's grip was firm and reformers were outnumbered. In 1873, the last major pieces of construction were completed. Central Park, stretching from 59th to 110th Street, was officially declared finished. The final cost was nearly $14 million, more than double the original estimate. Tens of thousands of New Yorkers poured through the gates to see what their city had created. They walked the Mall beneath the towering elms, rowed boats across the lake, and rode horses through the winding drives. The press called it the lungs of the city. For a few moments, the city's divisions faded, and the park stood as a symbol of shared achievement. Yet beneath the celebration, Olmsted and Vaux were already gone. Both had resigned, exhausted by years of struggle. Their design had survived, but at a cost. By the time Central Park was declared complete in 1873, New York City had changed. The Civil War was over. Industry was booming. Railroads stretched across the nation, and wealth was rising fast in certain parts of the city. But beneath that glitter, the social fabric was fraying. For the park that was meant to unite everyone, a new battle was beginning, not against design or politics, but against time, neglect, and inequality. When Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux walked away from the project, they left behind a masterpiece, still young and fragile. They had shaped the lakes and meadows, but not the future that would protect them. At first, the park drew crowds of curious visitors. Families came to picnic. Couples rowed boats across the lake. Musicians played on the Mall. But as years passed, the excitement faded, and the city's attention drifted elsewhere.
Without Olmsted's steady guidance, maintenance slipped. Grass grew tall and untrimmed, roads cracked, benches broke. The trees, once carefully chosen and planted, were left without care. The park had been designed as a balance of order and nature, but now both began to crumble. In the 1870s, New York was a city of extremes. Wealthy residents lived in new brownstones along Fifth Avenue, right beside the park's eastern edge. They treated the park as their private promenade, riding carriages on Sunday afternoons. Meanwhile, working-class families crowded into tenements downtown. They could not spare time to stroll through the park, nor afford the car fare to reach it. The very park that was built for all people had quietly become a playground for the few. The press began to notice. Some reporters described Central Park as a garden of the privileged. Others said it was no longer the democratic refuge Olmsted imagined. The Central Park Commission, still under city control, failed to manage it well. Money was short, and the new officials had little understanding of the park's design.
Calvert Vos wrote bitterly in a letter that the park is losing its soul. Paths were altered to accommodate new roads, unapproved buildings appeared, political appointees replaced skilled caretakers. The subtle harmony that Olmsted and Vost had crafted, where every curve, pond, and bridge served a purpose, was broken piece by piece. Even the rules changed. Activities once banned for disrupting peace, such as loud performances and commercial events, began to appear. The park was slipping away from its original promise. The late 1870s brought deeper trouble. The Panic of 1873, an economic collapse, had left thousands jobless. Protests and strikes filled the streets. New York was restless, and Central Park, once a symbol of civic pride, became a stage for anger and despair. In 1874, police clashed with demonstrators near the park's edge during a labor rally. A few years later, a violent protest by unemployed workers ended in arrests. The park that was meant to heal the city's divisions now reflected them. Yet not everyone gave up. A few park keepers, ordinary men who loved the place, did what they could. They patched broken paths, cared for flowers, and chased away vandals. Their names were rarely recorded, but their effort kept the park from falling into complete ruin. Some citizens also began to speak up. Newspapers ran editorials calling for reform. Civic groups petitioned the city to restore the park's maintenance and design. The seeds of change were small, but they were there. In 1877, reform-minded city officials invited Frederick Law Olmsted back as an unpaid consultant. His health was declining, but his attachment to the park never faded. He walked its paths, taking notes on what had been altered. He found broken roads, dying trees, and poorly built additions that clashed with the original design. He urged the city to remove them. His reports were sharp, but calm, written in his usual measured tone. He warned that a public work of art, if left unguarded, decays in both body and purpose. His advice was not always followed, but it reminded the city what Central Park once stood for. While Olmsted struggled with illness, Calvert Vos continued to fight quietly for the park's integrity. He designed small restorations, bridges, terraces, and garden layouts to preserve what he could. He also worked on nearby projects, including Riverside Park and Morningside Park, both meant to extend the spirit of Central Park into other neighborhoods. But by the 1880s, public taste had shifted toward more structured recreation, zoos, playgrounds, and entertainment venues. The idea of a natural refuge felt old-fashioned to many city officials. Voss's quiet advocacy often fell on deaf ears. Yet, he never abandoned his belief that the park's purpose was moral as much as physical, to give people dignity through beauty. By the late 1880s, small improvements began to reappear. Citizens groups raised funds for maintenance. Gardeners were rehired. Lawns were reseeded. For the first time in years, new trees were planted where old ones had died.
The Metropolitan Museum of Art, opened on the park's edge in 1880, brought new attention to the area. Visitors who came for art began to rediscover the park itself. Children ran across the Great Lawn. Rowboats returned to the lake. Bands played gentle music on Sundays. Slowly, the park began to breathe again. Frederick Law Olmsted moved on to other projects, including Boston's Emerald Necklace and the grounds of the U.S. Capitol. His health declined through the 1880s, and by 1890, his public work came to an end. Calvert Vos' life ended tragically in 1895 when he drowned in Gravesend Bay under uncertain circumstances. Many believed exhaustion and disappointment had weighed on him. Yet together their work had survived decades of neglect and politics. The park they imagined had endured, not in perfect form, but still alive, still used, still loved. By the dawn of the 1890s, New York City was a different world from the one that had birthed Central Park. Electric lights glowed where oil lamps once flickered. Streetcars hummed across iron rails. Buildings grew taller each year, and the first whispers of a skyline began to appear. The park, sitting quietly in the heart of this industrial surge, faced a new challenge. It was no longer a frontier of nature, it was an island surrounded by progress. As factories spread northward and railroads grew louder, Central Park began to feel pressure from every side. The clean air that Olmsted once described as a balm for the city now mixed with smoke from nearby chimneys. Horse-drawn carriages still circled the drives, but the sounds of machinery carried across the meadows. The park's stone bridges, once symbols of harmony between man and nature, now stood against the harsh rhythm of industry. New Yorkers were working longer hours than ever. When they came to the park, they sought relief from the noise and grit of the city. Yet the same modern forces that exhausted them were creeping into their refuge. The 1890s also brought enormous population growth. Immigration from Europe poured millions into New York. Tenements spread through the Lower East Side, and families lived in crowded, airless rooms. To reformers, Central Park became more than a pleasure ground. It was a lifeline. They argued that the park could restore health and morale to a wary public. Doctors wrote that a walk in the park may save a life. But others saw opportunity of another kind. Land developers eyed the park's borders, knowing that property near its edges was worth fortunes. Fifth Avenue turned into a showcase of mansions for the city's elite. Inside the park's walls, however, the struggle to keep its public purpose alive continued. By the mid-1890s, New Yorkers' idea of leisure was changing. The quiet strolls and carriage rides that once defined the park were giving way to sports, gatherings, and festivals. Young men played baseball on the open fields. Ice skaters filled the frozen ponds in winter. In summer, thousands gathered for concerts at the mall. At first, officials resisted these changes, fearing that too much activity would ruin Olmsted's carefully planned harmony. But the public's will was stronger. The park was theirs now, and they wanted to use it. To meet demand, the city introduced new facilities, playgrounds, tennis courts, and ball fields, though each addition stirred debate about whether such changes betrayed the park's original spirit. Technology brought both wonder and disruption. Electric lamps were installed along paths for safety, ending the park's once deep darkness at night. Photographers came with new portable cameras, capturing families and lovers under the trees. Small kiosks sold refreshments and postcards. But for every improvement, something was lost. The silence Olmsted cherished was fading. Crowds grew louder, roads busier, and nature less wild. Many critics feared the park was turning into an amusement ground, a place of entertainment rather than contemplation. Newspapers argued whether Central Park should remain a rural escape or evolve into a modern city center. During this period, the Central Park Police Precinct grew in importance. Officers patrolled on horseback, maintaining order among swelling crowds. Pickpocketing, gambling, and vandalism rose as more visitors poured in. Yet, for all its troubles, the park remained a rare common ground in a city deeply divided by wealth and origin. Irish immigrants, Italian families, and wealthy New Yorkers all walked the same paths. Though not always together, they shared the same air and shade. It was an unspoken experiment in coexistence. While the city modernized, the memory of the park's founders faded into history. Frederick Law Olmsted, retired and ill, spent his final years in Massachusetts. Before his death in 1903, he wrote that Central Park had been the most difficult and perhaps the most hopeful work of my life. Calvert Vos was gone, his death in 1895 still a quiet mystery. But his influence lived on through the bridges and terraces he had designed, structures that blended stone, water, and greenery with a grace unmatched by later builders. The new generation of architects and planners, inspired by their legacy, began to see urban design as more than utility. It was art. As the Gilded Age reached its height, wealth flooded New York. The park's eastern edge glittered with mansions owned by the city's richest families, the Vanderbilts, Astors, and Carnegies. Their private carriages rolled down the drives in elegant processions, watched by poorer citizens who entered the park on foot. It was a visual portrait of the city's divide, luxury and poverty, side by side. Still, on Sundays, when the factories closed and workers filled the lawns, those differences seemed to blur. Families rested under the same trees that shaded the rich. Children chased pigeons across the same grass. For a few hours each week, Central Park achieved what Olmsted had always hoped for: equality through shared space. As the 20th century approached, the park was again at a crossroads. New York's population had surpassed 3 million. Automobiles began to appear on city streets, bringing speed and noise that clashed with the park's peaceful paths. Horse carriages gave way to motor cars, and the debate began anew. Should machines be allowed through the park's drives? Many argued that allowing cars would ruin the quiet refuge. Others said progress could not be stopped. By 1906, the first motor vehicles began crossing the park. For some, it was a symbol of modern triumph. For others, it was the sound of nature being silenced. Despite all the change, Central Park still held emotional power over New Yorkers. On holidays, thousands gathered for public celebrations. On quiet days, artists painted the lakes and poets wrote under the elms. It was no longer just a park, it was part of the city's identity. To remove it would have been to erase part of New York's soul. Through 2 decades of iron, industry, and invention, the park remained a constant reminder of something older and more human: the need for open space, for rest, for peace amid the storm of progress. By 1910, the city's leaders began to understand that the park could not survive without deliberate care. Citizens groups, inspired by the reform movements of the Progressive Era, began advocating for better management and restoration. Architects revisited Olmsted's writings. City planners studied the park's original maps to understand what had been lost. There was a new sense that Central Park was not just public property, it was public inheritance.
The next chapter would see the first real effort to preserve that inheritance. It would be a time when New York tried to balance 2 worlds: the rush of modern life and the quiet endurance of nature. The park had survived corruption, decay, and progress. Now it would face its hardest question yet: how to remain timeless in a city that refused to stand still. By 1910, Central Park had endured more than 50 years of construction, politics, neglect, and the pressures of a growing metropolis. The park had survived the ambitions of developers, the noise of industry, and the tides of social unrest. Now it faced a different challenge, proving that it could belong to everyone in a city of millions. The early 20th century brought the Progressive Era, a period of social reform and civic activism in New York. Reformers pushed for public health, better housing, and access to education. Central Park became part of that movement, a living laboratory for improving urban life. Groups such as the Municipal Art Society argued that the park should be preserved not only for beauty, but for health and democracy.
They reminded city leaders that Olmsted and Vaux had built the park to serve all classes, not just the wealthy. Efforts to restore the park gained momentum. Flower beds were replanted, roads and bridges were repaired, playgrounds and ball fields were expanded. Visitors began to see the park as both a place of leisure and a space for civic pride. Unlike previous decades, ordinary citizens now played a critical role in the park's preservation. Neighborhood associations, schools, and civic groups organized cleanup campaigns, tree planting efforts, and public concerts. Children flocked to new playgrounds. Families picnicked on the Great Lawn. The Ramble, once overgrown and feared by some as unsafe, became a place for walking and birdwatching. The park was reclaiming its democratic purpose. Its spaces were no longer dominated by the elite or shaped solely by politics. They were being restored by the people themselves. Technology and urban growth continued to test the park's boundaries. Automobiles increased along the outer drives. Streetcars rattled nearby. Bridges and paths were maintained to shield the landscape from noise and traffic. Trees and plantings were placed to create visual barriers, softening the intrusion of city life. Olmsted's vision of blending nature with urban structure remained the guiding principle even decades after his death. By the 1920s, Central Park had become more than a recreational space. It was a symbol of New York itself. Artists painted the lakes and bridges. Writers described walks through the mall and the Ramble in novels and essays. Photographers captured the city reflected in the lake. The park became a stage for public events, from political rallies to musical performances. Yet administrators and citizens worked together to ensure that these activities did not overwhelm the landscape. The park was alive, but it remained a place of refuge. The challenges Central Park had faced, political interference, corruption, neglect, and social inequality, were not entirely solved. But by 1930, the city had learned the importance of stewardship. A balance was emerging, one between the beauty of nature and the needs of an industrial, modern city, between the rights of private wealth and the public good, between the demands of urban growth and the need for timeless spaces. The park's history had taught a powerful lesson. Beauty and democracy required vigilance. Left alone, even the most carefully designed space could be threatened. But with attention, care, and public involvement, it could endure. By the end of this period, Central Park had cemented its role as a place that belonged to everyone. Irish and Italian immigrants, African American families, the wealthy, the working poor, children, and the elderly all shared its paths and lawns. Central Park's story was one of struggle and triumph, of vision and resistance. It had survived political machinations, the pressures of urbanization, and decades of neglect. It had been claimed by both corruption and community, and through it all, the ideals of its creators endured. Its lakes reflected the skyline, its trees offered shade, and its meadows welcomed crowds. The park was more than green space. It was a living testament to the power of public vision, civic engagement, and the belief that a city could provide beauty and peace for all its people. By 1930, the foundations laid by Olmsted and Vaux had become permanent. Their vision had survived decades of challenge. Central Park was no longer just a project. It was a part of New York's identity. It had endured controversy and hardship, yet it remained a refuge, a place of equality, and a symbol of the city's enduring ability to balance human ambition with nature. The story of Central Park is a story of vision, struggle, and perseverance, a testament to what a city can achieve when it dares to dream for everyone.